Upserting is the principle of creating a resource with put or patch. Let's look into that, because this type of functionality is often misinterpreted and it can cause quite a bit of confusion. We've got a consumer of the API on the left and the API server on the right. In a lot of systems, it's the server that is responsible for creating the identifier of a resource. Part of it is often the underlying key in the data store, an integer value, for example. A consumer might post a new author to the author's resource, and the server responds with that newly created author in the response body and the location of the author resource, including the underlying integer key the server generated in the location header. You see an example of such a URI on screen here. In fact, in most systems, it's the server that decides on the resource URI. But REST does not have this as a requirement. It is perfectly valid to have a system where the consumer is responsible for creating the URI, or where it is allowed for both the consumer and the server. Now, if the key in the database is part of the resource URI, this doesn't just work with auto number fields. And maybe that is why I've used GUIDs in my demo application. So, if you're wondering why I'm not using auto number fields or identity columns in the sample code, this is why. I wanted to be able to show you this. A good example would be working with GUIDs, where a client application can choose the GUID that eventually serves as key in the data store. Now, let's think about what could happen. Say that the server is responsible for creating the resource URI, and we want to send an update request. We need to get the URI for the resource from the server to be able to update it. That means that the resource must exist already. If it doesn't, a 404 not found is returned. In this case, if we want to create a resource, we must use post, because we cannot know the URI of the resource in advance. Now let's imagine that the consumer is also allowed to create resource URIs. In that case, we no longer need to get the URI from the server. In that case, the hard requirement for the resource to exist before being allowed to update it vanishes, because we can now send a put or patch request to a previously unexisting resource identifier that is valid, because we can create it by sending the put or patch request. In a way, you can look at this like updating a resource from being empty to containing something. And that principle is called upserting. Now let's think back about method idempotency to see if this still fits. As we learned, post is not idempotent. Sending the same request more than once will result in different outcomes. That is still the case. Put and patch, however, are idempotent, and that fits as well. If the consumer of the API chooses the resource URI, sending the request once will create it. Sending it again after that will have the exact same result. Let's see how we can implement support for this with a demo.